Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. We're in the lab of Dr. Frank Guenther at Boston University, and he's going to explain neural prosthesis for us. He'll give us some background to begin with about the brain and about language processing. Dr. Guenther, welcome. And
thanks for having me.
I'd like to ask you, why is the brain so complicated in terms of language? Why is this such a complicated phenomenon?
Well, language is unique to humans, of course, and it involves a very large number of parts of the brain, including prefrontal cortex areas that are involved in cognition, so formulating what you want to say and creating the words that you want to project out to the listener. Then this information has to be transferred into movements of the speech articulators, so the lips and the tongue and the jaw. And the speech articulation system is one of the most complex motor systems out there. It's the most complex act that humans perform. It involves over 100 muscles in the respiratory system and the vocal tract and the tongue. And somehow these words have to be translated into appropriate movements of these articulators. And the end goal of this has to be a sound signal that's sent to the user. So sensory information is very important as well. So auditory information in particular that tells you that the sounds that you intend are coming out properly. Because it involves all this high-level cognitive information, motor information, and sensory information, it's one of the highest level, most complicated tasks that the brain performs, and possibly the most complicated.
Okay. Well, what can go wrong?
Well, a lot of things can go wrong in this system, and in particular, we look at cases where the brain has been damaged through stroke, and there are several levels in the system that are commonly encountered as a result of stroke. The highest level sort of stroke would be in the left inferior frontal gyrus. So that's part of the prefrontal cortex. That's a highly cognitive sort of area. That's damage to that area results in what's known as Broca's aphasia. And Broca's aphasia is an inability to formulate sentences and produce language output. Broca's aphasics have very limited verbal output. Sometimes they can only say one word, for example. Lower level damage, slightly lower in the hierarchy, which would be in the premotor cortex, results in what we would call apraxia of speech. And in apraxia of speech, the brain is able to formulate sentences, but it's unable to get the motor programs it needs to move the tongue and the speech articulators to produce the sound. So this is more of a motor programming problem. People who have apraxia of speech can formulate sentences, but it's very frustrating. They're unable to get the right syllables to come out when they try to speak. Even lower on the hierarchy would be damage to the motor cortex. This would involve something like a stroke in a lower level of the brain below the cortex that would eliminate voluntary motor output, for example, or through a disease like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, which involves degeneration of the neurons from the motor cortex projecting out to the muscles. And over time, people with this sort of disorder will lose the ability to move, including the ability to move their speech articulators in many cases.
In terms of your work here, and you're at the very frontier of this, in terms of modeling this, what does your lab do, and what maybe does the field do?
Okay, well that's a 20-year story,
yes,
effectively. So we started out formulating a model of the brain that basically had elements that corresponded to the different regions of the brain that are involved in speech, and the model is a neural network model, which means we're basically producing in a computer modeled neurons and synaptic connections between the neurons, and by changing these synaptic connections, the model learns. So In our case, the model needs to learn to use the vocal tract to produce speech sounds that we present it from our language. And so it goes through a babbling cycle and produces random sounds. It uses the information from the motor commands it was generating combined with the sound that came out to learn the relationships between sensory and motor information. And this learning process basically tunes up the motor controller, the parts of the model that produce the actual movements of the tongue and the speech articulators to produce sound. Now, we started modeling, I started modeling back in around 1990, and I produced an initial version of this model that was based on existing literature. So people had run experiments on speech for many years. And so I used insights from the existing literature to formulate an initial model that tried to capture the behaviors that are reported in these studies. And about that same time, brain imaging technology came along, which allowed us to look at the human brain while it's active during a task such as speech. And this was revolutionary for our field because now we could actually see the working brain during speech, something that had never been looked at before. And so we started combining experiments using this technology with the modeling work to refine our model. So, for example, we can make predictions from the model about what should happen if I perturb the auditory feedback you hear of your speech while you're speaking so that it sounds slightly different than you expect. So, for example, we created a device where we could, in real time, change the perception of a word like bet to sound more like bit or bat on occasional production trials. And our model makes a very specific prediction about what brain areas should light up when we make this shift. And if our model is correct, then we have verification of it. If it's incorrect, we have information that we use to refine the model and make a better model. Now, we've done that process for 20 years now in the lab, so we have a highly refined model, which is now the leading model in the field, that explains the neural mechanisms underlying normal speech. And what we've been doing in recent years is using that model to starting to look at disorders of speech that occur because of some sort of problem in the nervous system. And there are a wide range of disorders that we've looked at. I've mentioned a few already. A very common disorder that we're spending a lot of time looking at now is stuttering, which affects about 1% of the population. And what we're doing in our stuttering research, stuttering is very interesting because it's been known throughout history and it occurs in every culture. And yet we still don't understand what causes it and how to stop it. And so what we're doing now is formulating a model of the brain areas that are involved in the initiation of the output of speech. These involve the basal ganglia in particular, interacting with the cerebral cortex to generate speech output. It appears from a number of studies that there's something wrong with this circuit, but what exactly is wrong with it is unclear. And what's powerful about our approach is that we build a computational model that actually has to generate the speech output using this circuit. And then we can damage this model in various ways and see what happens in the model. So, for example, we can make a stuttering version of the model that has impaired axons in one portion of the brain. That's something that's been seen in some studies of speech, looking at the white matter in the brain in people who stutter. Well, we can implement that in the model and we can see what happens both behaviorally in terms of its speech output. So how does it stutter? Does it do movements that are similar to an actual person who stutters? And we can also look at its brain activity, and that's what's unique about our model. It has both a behavioral output and a neural output, which we can very directly compare to the results of our neuroimaging experiment. Our model's components, the neurons in the model, are actually localized in a brain space that's the same brain space that we use to study brain imaging experiment results. So we look at fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, where we can look at blood flow in the brain, which goes to active areas in the brain. Well, the results of those experiments are described in the same space as the simulation results of our model, so we can do a very direct comparison. Is our model predicting activity in the proper areas of the brain?
Then once you do this, then you're trying to do an application of this.
Right.
And what's involved with that? Can you describe it?
So we use the model in several different ways to look at disorder. So one way is the way I was just describing, which is to characterize the disorder and just better understand it for now, so that later we can think about ways to try to fix it, perhaps with drugs, perhaps with technologies. A very concrete example that we've been working on involves people who have damage to the motor output pathways that's severe enough to leave them completely paralyzed, or what we refer to as a locked-in syndrome. The people are conscious, they can hear, they can see, but they can't speak or move. And what we're trying to do in these cases is provide them with a communication channel to speak either, through a computer, in this case, through a synthesizer that we have on a computer. And we're approaching this in a couple of different ways. One way is to try to decode the actual neural activities in their motor cortex. And this involves collaboration with researchers who have actually developed hardware that they can implant in the brains of people who have locked-in syndrome. And we worked with Dr. Philip Kennedy in particular in Georgia, who developed an electrode that could be permanently implanted and was implanted into the speech motor area of the brain of somebody who was locked in due to a stroke that occurred after a car accident. This patient's brain signals were very, very complex to decode, and we started collaborating with Dr. Kennedy because we had our model, which made predictions, very specific predictions, about what the neurons were actually encoding in that part of the brain. What was the information that we should be trying to pull out of that part of the brain, and how could we interpret that information in terms of speech? And so what we did in that project was we developed a brain-computer interface that decoded the speech signals from the motor cortex while the patient was trying to speak. So these are signals in the areas of the brain that are controlling the speech articulators, in particular the tongue. And we were pulling off what we thought were the sounds. We tried to decode the sounds by having the person first imitate a set of sounds that we scripted for them. We collected brain signals during this imitation process, and we built a decoder that would go from those brain signals and map them into a predicted sound signal that we could play over the computer speaker to the person who was locked in. And after this process of collecting about a minute of data of them attempting to imitate what was basically a vowel sequence, we then allowed them to control the synthesizer and to try to produce vowels that we presented to them. So the speaker was able to learn to produce vowels with this synthesizer. Now, the synthesizer we were using at the time was very limited, was capable only of producing vowel sound. That was partly due to the technology limitations at the time. This implant occurred about 9 years ago now, the actual implantation. And so at the time, the electrodes that we were working with had very low channel capacity. There were only really 2 wires coming from the brain that we were decoding neural signals from. And so we had to have a very simple synthesizer for the patient to use, since we had so little information from the brain. With today's more modern implants, we could have a much higher throughput system. So a 100-channel system is more standard now. And we're hopeful of being able to have a patient implanted with a 100-channel system to control synthesizer that would produce both vowels and consonants in the next few years. But as you know, this sort of research is very time-intensive. And for example, a lot of money and time have to go into getting FDA approval for us to even use an existing electrode in our own surgeries. So we're working through these processes now, but in the meantime, we're working both with new software, with several things. One is improved synthesizers. So we have synthesizers now that can do vowels and consonants, which are controllable with this sort of interface. We're testing new hardware with more channel capacity in monkeys before we start working toward human approval for this sort of study. And so we're testing new electronics and hardware in collaboration with a researcher at MIT, Earl Miller, who has a monkey lab where we are testing these things. And finally, we are also working on brain-computer interfaces that don't rely on intracranial implants, so that don't require surgery for an implantation. And these are designed in a somewhat different way that John Romberg will describe later, but these involve decoding intention of a speaker, not necessarily in their intention to speak, but their intentions more generally in a way that can be used to control a communication interface on a computer that doesn't let them speak directly in real time necessarily straight through the interface, but allows them to choose pre-canned phrases, important phrases, and so forth that they can
that you could add up and accumulate. Yeah, right.
So we're talking in several different ways with different technologies and through several different collaborations, both with developers of hardware, with electrophysiologists doing monkey experiments in this case, and with medical professionals who help us find these locked-in patients to work with in our experiments.
Are people in the future who are interested in doing this kind of research, and does the field itself depend on these multiple skills?
Sure. So the heart of what we do is what would be called computational neuroscience, and computational neuroscience is the use of computational techniques that have been developed in mathematics and engineering and computer science, and using those to study the brain. And there are many different ways to do this, and we've talked about two different ways that we do it in our lab. One way is to actually model the brain with neural networks that are, again, are computational constructs that allow us to model functioning in the brain. But another completely different way that we use computational techniques to investigate and address brain function is by decoding brain signals using engineering techniques and a number of different techniques that have been developed, and developing our own new techniques, mathematical techniques that are fine-tuned for the particular problems that we look at, which have to do with translating either EEG signals collected from the scalp, which represent one form of electrical activity from the brain, or intracranial signals, which involve spiking neurons, and it's a very different form of electrical activity in the brain. We need techniques for translating both of these types of information into some sort of output prediction of what the intention of the user of the interface is.
Right, and that's a lot of work.
Right.
That's going to take some time.
And
but it looks like it's really come a long way.
Well, it has, and that's a combination of people on the research team that have different backgrounds, but it's also important for at least some central people on the team to understand many different aspects of the project. And so, speaking for my role, I understand much of the computational aspects of the project, but I also am an expert in cognitive neuroscience, so I've studied how the brain controls speech and language, and so having the insight into the brain function has been very useful for development of our particular types of interfaces, which are trying to decode speech from the brain. And so the combination of the neuroscience training and the kind of engineering and mathematical training in my background has been very important for getting to this point.
Exactly.
Now, different people on the team have different combinations of skills. Exactly. I guess one of the last things that I would like to say is just a piece of advice to students who are interested in this, is that one thing that many students don't understand until it's late in the process is how important just the ability to program a computer is. So computer programming, even though neuroscience doesn't seem on the surface to be something that's heavily involved in computer programming is completely widespread in our project at many levels. So writing programs to do the experiments, to analyze experimental data, to implement brain-computer interfaces. Every step of the way requires programming, and so one of my own missions is to try to get more computer programming courses in the undergraduate curriculum to prepare people for grad school, where they're in almost any science field going to be required to do substantial amounts of programming. Our lab is very crucial for people to be able to at least understand what everybody is talking about. So people in our lab may focus in one of the areas, but generally they are familiar with several areas, and usually they focus in actually a couple of different areas. So understanding the brain and using mathematical techniques to characterize brain function, for example, or understanding speech disorders and understanding how these models can help us study this disorder. So we have speech pathologists in the lab, we have computational neuroscientists in the lab, and we have people who are essentially engineers in the lab as well. A lot of our work, most of the work that we'll talk about today, was funded by a large center grant from NSF called Celeste, which is a center of excellence for education and learning in science and technology, and this grant is involving many researchers, not just at Boston University in several departments, but researchers at other universities, including two of the collaborators I've mentioned, Earl Miller at MIT, who's been a great collaborator for us to get to test out some of the technologies with his electrophysiology lab, and Philip Kennedy in Georgia. Celeste helped us go down and work with him and work with the patient that we were there using the interface with. So Celeste is the sort of thing that actually is ideal for this sort of project, because this project requires several investigators working together in different labs to really address the problems that we're addressing. And through this sort of large center grant that more or less forces collaboration across normal boundaries, we are able to make great progress in this area. And the educational component of this is very important as well. And Celeste has focused not just on understanding how the brain learns, but also on actually providing neuroscience education and education that's interdisciplinary and allows people to start addressing the sorts of problems that we address.
This is Dr. John Romberg, who is the co-director of this lab, and he's going to explain to us the part of the work that he does and the kind of preparation that people need. Welcome, Dr. Romberg.
Thank you.
Okay, and I'd like to start by asking, what is the project that you're working on here? We heard a little bit of the two projects, and yours is this brain-computer interface specifically. If you'd explain it.
Sure. So I started working on the intracortical implanted project. I was a graduate student at Boston University at the time, and it was a great combination of the computational neuroscience skills I was learning, plus my background in computer science and programming and human experiments in psychology. So this was a natural way for me to move forward. We completed that project, and it left the open question, how do we sort of promote this technology? How do we get this out into even more users who could potentially be benefited by a device like this? And the answer is looking for something that's non-invasive, something that exists out there that's relatively cheap and moderately easy to commercialize or at least mass produce in some way. And so EEG, electroencephalography, is one potential way of doing this, and it's one of the reasons is that we know so much about it. It's been around for a very long time, and there are so many signals that are available to us. So that was the direction that I started to take with my own research, and then the research that's going on in the lab right now. We have a couple of avenues of EEG research. One is for controlling the same type of vowel speech synthesizer. The interesting thing is that in the previous conversations we've been having, the intracortical implant only had 2 wires. And we said that that was sort of a low channel count. Well, the interesting thing about EEG is that even though we have many sensors, in our case we use a cap that has over 48 sensors, the information that you get from EEG is so different from the stuff that you get from inside of the brain that we still can probably only control 2, maybe 3 types of movements at the same time, so we're still left with this low channel count, this low information count. So we're focusing on that side of the project on vowel synthesis and vowel prediction again. And that's for real-time continuous output. So that's one aspect of the project that we're working on. And the signal that uses, they're called sensory motor rhythms. They're related to motor activations in the brain, very similar to the intracortical implants that we had been working with before. They can be kind of difficult to train subjects or users who are attempting to modulate their sensory motor rhythms. Need to be taught how to do it. We do this naturally. So when we move our arms around and we move our articulators around, when we walk, these sorts of things changes the way that our brain responds. In particular, changes these sensory motor rhythms. We can achieve the same type of modulation through imagining movements. So if I were to imagine moving my hand rather than actually moving my hand, there would be a sensory motor rhythm modulation. So what we primarily work with right now are healthy users, healthy subjects, who we have to ask to imagine doing those things. And right now, an open question is whether or not people who are paralyzed, our target population, is the healthy subject motor imagery equivalent to a paralyzed person actually trying to move. And so it's like I said, it's an open question, and the training component is definitely there for for healthy subjects. The training might not necessarily be quite so severe for a paralyzed subject because they are actually trying to move. On the other hand, it could be even harder because they haven't, they may potentially not have been moving for so long. So this is sort of a much more leading edge experimental type of interface that is well complemented to the more robust, more immediately available interfaces that we're working on, and we're using a rhythm called a potential called the steady state visual evoked potential. Now this is a visual cortex, an area of the brain that responds to light coming in from your eyes, visual stimuli. And it's one of these potentials that we can't do anything about. And it exists in just about every single person that we run through the protocol, through the paradigm. And what it involves is presenting a visual stimulus, a flash. And we use checkerboards on the screen. So you can imagine a checkerboard flashing really fast. And that flashing creates a stereotypical response in the visual areas of your brain. And what we're able to do is decode those rhythms, determine what that stereotypical response is, associate it with the stimulus that was being shown on the screen, and therefore we have an ability to make a decision on what the user was intending to do related to the choices that were being made on the screen. So this is the type of thing that we're going to show a little bit later.
Yes.
And this is, like I said, this is one of these responses that we as humans, there's nothing that we can really do about it. It happens, and we can observe it, which makes it an ideal rhythm or potential to use for a brain-machine interface.
Where do you see this all going, say, in 10 years? What are the prospects for helping people with the brain-computer interface? Do you see a lot of rapid progress now, or you think it's just going to be nail-biting?
That's a really good question, because right now we've been focusing on locked-in syndrome. That's been our main focus, and it's a lot of the main focus of the field, that and ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. And there's been a lot of progress on decoding methods, finding out what brain signals are best to use, and what stimuli are best to use. I've just described two of them, the SSVEP and the sensory motor rhythms. And that is, a lot of that is ongoing, and it's very important. But the next part of actually translating our research that we do in the lab into the field, how do we do that? That's where a lot of the movement in the field is right now, getting into rehabilitation. And that's where I think a lot of the progress is going to be. And we're going to start broadening out beyond the traditional locked-in syndrome, brainstem stroke, ALS populations, and look into, well, who else could potentially benefit from a device like this. There's a number of researchers in the field that look to kids and adults with cerebral palsy.
That's a good one.
They have movement. It's not the same as ALS or locked-in syndrome, where movement is cut off, but the movements can be so disordered and so inaccurate that it's almost functionally locked in. They're not able to do the types of things that they want to be able to do. And so that population introduces its whole new set of issues to overcome with brain-computer interfaces. But I think that could be a really large avenue of a direction that the field will take. In addition to some of the more higher level strokes, I don't want to call them more standard strokes, but not locked-in syndrome, brainstem strokes. There's a couple of researchers in the field that are looking into that population for sort of immediate care post-stroke, and that could be another huge avenue for getting communication right away when you're in the hospital, even. And so that would be a great thing for providing the patient with an ability to communicate with doctors and family members immediately post-stroke.
Right, right. So you think that down the line, another decade or so, that it's a very hopeful prospect for people with various levels of disability?
Absolutely. The core of this technology and the core of the research that we do is empowering and enabling people with speech and motor disabilities. It reintegrates, it allows these people to become part of the community, whether it's for long-term care. If you have cerebral palsy, locked-in syndrome, you want to be able to participate in your society.
Exactly.
As well as acutely in a hospital setting, potentially. Both of those types of communication, both of those types of interaction are incredibly important. And this technology has the prospect of actually facilitating that communication.
You had multiple disciplines as well. Did you expect that when you trekked off to college? Did you?
So I actually had a pretty interesting background. I said I was a computer scientist. Like many undergraduates, I changed my degree a number of times. And I started out as an engineer, where I learned all about circuits and building circuits and building engineering devices. And then I switched to computer science, where programming was a very natural fit. And I was also a philosophy major, so and a lot of people ask me, how does that fit together?
Yes,
well,
it does.
when you get to this point, we're studying computational neuroscience with an engineering bent, with this idea of speech rehabilitation, getting out into almost a clinical application. All of those perspectives play an enormous part in the whole project. And it's, people always talk about having something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And really that's what this type of interdisciplinary education does for you. It makes you not just a computer scientist, it makes you not just a neuroscientist, it makes you something even greater than both of those combined. And that's actually what we need. I have students who ask me, well, I'm a biologist, I have a biology background, or I'm a physicist. Can I get into your field? And the answer is yes.
Absolutely.
Because and from my experience when I was a graduate student, I had my background, but my classmates, one was a biology, had a biology background, another had a psychology background. And what we're able to do is work together, work within our educational experience to sort of learn the things that we don't know, and sometimes even completely switch careers. So the biologist might become a computationalist completely. And in my case, they sort of melded together very well. Computer science and programming and understanding how algorithms work and how to put a device together and string things together to solve this complex problem clearly made a bigger impact in my life. I was able to think of what my device was going to be, think of what my problem was, determine the solution, and immediately implement it. And determine if it worked. And one of my challenges, and one of the things that I like to do for all the students that are in the lab who come from this diverse background, there's bioengineers, there's neuroscientists, there are undergraduate neuroscientists, there are speech students, speech pathology students, is getting across this idea of you can program what needs to be programmed. No one has to, you don't have to be a computer science expert in order to understand how to put together the different elements of a brain-machine interface. Some people will do the heavy lifting that is not necessary for everyone to understand, but everyone has the ability to develop this device in some way.
That's very good, because a lot of people think, no, that nerdy stuff is not for me. And by the same token, the people that like the engineering side say, well, that philosophy stuff is irrelevant to me. But in fact, all of this is coming toward like a new renaissance, isn't it? You have to kind of be a renaissance person to get into this field. But it would be very appealing, I think, to a lot of people if they could get over these hurdles. That something is just too intimidating. To do.
And to that point, I can think of two things. One is academic institutions are pushing interdisciplinary education now. And I feel like we've been ahead of the curve because we've needed it. And now we can be leaders for that interdisciplinary push. And then the second side of this was, for the type of work that we do in this lab, this speech and communication aspect, learning speech and communication, someone from an engineering field might think, oh, that doesn't really fit with the type of work that I've traditionally done, but it made such a huge impact on what we were able to accomplish. We were able to make relationships between what we think is going on in speech, what we know is going on in speech, what the neuroscience said, and what techniques do we have available to switch between them. Without all three of those components, that doesn't happen.
Exactly.
And so having that interdisciplinary thing, education from the very technical to the very clinical, almost, and very behavioral, is what helped make that happen.
Right. I'd like to know how this affects the training of people in speech pathology today.
So speech-language pathology has had a long mission of providing some form of communication medium to the types of patients and users and individuals that we've been talking about. The global name for this field is augmentative and alternative communication. These things range from the most simple of devices where you have a family member or a caretaker holding up a board and it has letters on it or it has words on it. And if you have some form of communication, so an eye blink, let's say, or you're able to squeeze your fist or something like that, and someone is able to observe that, you can say, is this letter correct? Is this letter correct? Is this letter correct? And when you get to the right one, the individual indicates that that's the correct one. To very computational devices that are our own computers, laptops that are programmed with really interesting programs that allow users to point to items with their eyes if they have eye control, or point to it with their head if they can move their head in certain ways. That still involves some amount of manual user input on the part of the individual with the motor impairment. The work that we do here takes it to the next level, where we eliminate that motor input, that manual input, not by choice, but because individuals who are using these devices no longer have that ability. And this is an obvious way of integrating the type of work that we do in this lab with work that's been done for decades. And we can really use the expertise of that environment, of that field, for how do we interact with patients who might be using this device? How do we even deploy our devices? And a key thing that is often forgotten, especially on the engineering side of things, is, well, what's the best device for a particular person? And how do we measure whether or not our efforts and our devices are actually working the way we intend them to help communication? And speech-language pathologists who specialize in alternative and augmentative communication are trained to assess both the individual prior to giving them some sort of communication device, but also assess the usage of that device and to determine if it is actually working as intended to improve communication and quality. So we're gonna see the device in action, and it's a mobile application. So this is part of our Unlock project. We're hopefully going to be able to deploy this to users who need a communication option. And the key thing here is that it is mobile and it is portable, so that it can move with them, so that they're not stuck in one place at one point in time.
Hey, this is Sean Lorenz, and he's a doctoral student, and he is going to demonstrate this brain and computer interface, which looks very, very portable. Sean, tell us about your background, please, and then we'll demonstrate.
Sure. I actually have a background in philosophy, and just to show that there are a lot of different backgrounds in our department. But then I eventually came into more of the neurobiology and took a few courses on computational neuroscience, loved it, and applied for this program that I'm in now, and have slowly learned how to pick up those other portions of fields that I didn't know anything about, such as computer science, and have kind of stumbled into the brain-computer interface work. It was something I've been interested in for about 5 or 10 years. So it was a pleasure to get to finally work on something like this project. My particular project in general is more of an applied approach to brain-computer interface. My whole project is meant to take it outside of the lab and have something that someone with locked-in syndrome could actually, or ALS, could use in their home. So I'm working with something called the steady state visually evoked potential, which is a common form of brain-computer interface where John mentioned it flashes different kinds of stimuli on a screen. We can pick that up in the visual areas of your brain, decode it, do some things on it, and help people to select something on the screen for communication purposes. So primarily what I'm doing is taking phrases based on common phrases used by people with locked-in from, or also from augmentative and alternative communication devices, so that they would have a way to communicate with the outside world in an easy way again. So they would just be able to put on an EEG cap and then be able to have some sort of function. The first round that we have it is just a grid, as you'll see, of different speech phrases, which will output with a speech synthesizer. What I'm working on next is taking this BCI and making it adaptive. So how can you make this more, not just about, okay, yes, I guessed correctly that you are looking up, and so it moves up, but how can you, based on the context of the situation that you're in, pick better words, better phrases for the user to be able to select. So let's say you're at the doctor's office and it would bring up, it recognizes it's 9 a.m. You have entered, by your GPS coordinates into a doctor's office. You want to select words that say things about medication or your pain levels, these sort of things. And it would automatically populate what those speech phrases are in the BCI to make it quicker for them to communicate.
That's excellent, and especially the doctor's office is a great idea, because of when you talk about pain, there are all kinds of pain, right? Or itching or whatever. These symptoms, the lexicon is enormous for this. And so you're saying that if the patient can generate it mentally, they can, this is designed ultimately to sort of represent it.
And help them to communicate faster.
Exactly. Can you demonstrate it for us?
I'd be happy to.
Okay, all right.
We're going to get this on you right now.
Why, that's even stylish, isn't
It's
it?
very stylish.
One thing I didn't mention was the portability. One nice thing about a cap like this is it completely transmits all of the signal information from the cap wirelessly using Bluetooth that can be picked up in any computer, laptop, or even tablet. So in the future, something like this could be used in like an Android tablet or whatever sort of commercially available tablet that could be made into some sort of software.
And this is very light. Is it pretty sturdy also, or do you have to be extremely careful with the electrodes and things?
It's pretty sturdy, and it's what's nice about the area that we're picking up is it's very robust signal, so it works quite well for a more real-world application of brain-computer interface.
Okay, that's a big accomplishment by itself. With the wet cap now, would the patient simply keep it on for, like more or less all day if they're going to be in a communication situation so they can avoid getting gelled or
Right, if they were wanting to communicate, they would have to keep the cap on. Yes.
Is there any, is one better than another? I'm just assuming the gel is more accurate or allows for, but I don't know.
Right, that has been the case. However, dry electrodes, they have been making leaps and bounds in progress, and they're getting to the point of being comparable to the point where you could just put a few dry electrodes in something like a baseball cap and it'd be much more comfortable and not look like this, and better for the user to wear for prolonged duration.
Now you're attached here.
I'm all attached.
To.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Can you explain what it is you're?
Sure. So this is just an amp. This brings in the electrodes.
Yeah.
Sends it to here.
Yeah.
And this is what processes, it does some processing and
Okay.
then transmits it to a computer where we try to process it and display things on the screen.
Right, and you're saying that ultimately you can do this on your cell phone or something, a smartphone.
Right, yeah, you
Smartphone
know,
would
your
be quite amazing.
Whatever
Yes,
sort of tablet or
exactly.
laptop you
It
have.
really means you're much more independent.
So Sean's looking at 4 flashing checkerboards in a left, right, up, and down location, and each one is flashing at a slightly different frequency. And in his mind's eye, he concentrates on one of them to either move left, right, up, or down. And by sampling for 4 seconds his brain signals, we're able to determine which of those choices he made with about a 90% accuracy. And this allows him to maneuver around this grid and choose words that he might want to say. So for example, Sean, can you say, "I'm thirsty"?
I'm thirsty.
And now say hello. You'll see every 4 seconds the location moves as a decision is made. He's moving toward the hello box now.
Hello.
And so he's able to choose words in this manner. In this case, we have a grid of fixed words, so there's only, in this case, 25 words to choose from. However, we're working on hierarchical systems and also the intelligent systems that Sean mentioned, which will have multiple layers of words for different locations. So for example, words can be said in the doctor's office and so forth. Sean, try one more. How about saying, "I'm in pain"?
Where is it? Oh, I see.
I'm in pain.
So as you can see,
I'm in pain.
he's able to do this very accurately, and this is what makes the system basically ready for deployment in the real world. So that's what we're working toward now with the Unlock project, is getting this system, the very system you're looking at here, out to people with locked-in syndrome and donating them the systems to use in their homes. One nice thing about this technology is that it doesn't take a tremendous amount of training. Basically, you just need to be able to concentrate on one of the different flashing stimuli, and with very little training, with a few minutes, we're able to start picking up more and more accurately your intended movement from this system.
I'm working on a project with non-invasive brain-computer interfaces, so with the EEG cap. I guess John mentioned it a little bit earlier that what we like to do is to use sensory motor rhythms to control a brain-computer interface. So that's the kind of brain-computer interface where the user is imagining movement, and their kind of imagined movement is being decoded in real time to control, for example, a cursor on a computer screen, or in our case, we'd really like to be able to control a speech synthesizer in real time. So my project is one of the first questions that we want to be able to answer in developing that kind of brain-computer interface, which is how do we know when the user intends to speak and when they're not? So for example, if you have a speech synthesizer that's being controlled in real time, you need to be able to turn off the speech synthesizer when the user, for example, gets to the end of a sentence or wants to pause, doesn't want to speak. You don't want the speech synthesizer to keep going. So my project is looking for, in the signal, what changes when the user is performing the motor imagery and what changes when they stop trying to perform motor imagery. And so it's very much a computer science problem. I studied computer science and neuroscience in undergraduate, and it's also engineering, math, so I've had to learn a bunch of different fields since coming to graduate school.
Fields. That doesn't quite sound like a curriculum, but did you have to kind of do it by the seat of the pants? You had to...
Absolutely.
Self-teaching. Is
Absolutely.
that the new trend for...
Yes, I've been learning it as it comes up.
Yeah,
It's
right.
so we're doing a lot of pattern recognition,
Yeah.
kind of machine learning types of problems that I wasn't an expert in coming into it. So I've been doing a lot of classes that are related to the research that I need to do. but it's also just kind of learning as I go along, talking to people who know about it, and kind of doing the research independently. Well, one thing that's nice is that you know, our department, the graduate program for neuroscience, understands that it's an interdisciplinary field. So there's a lot of flexibility in the curriculum for people to take classes that are relevant to what they're doing. I think for me, it helped to have kind of a broad undergraduate education. So I had done, you know, on the neuroscience side, I had a good foundation in neuroscience, so it wasn't really hard to pick it up, but I also had done programming in undergrad. I'd done computer science theory and, you know, certain math classes. So I think, you know, it's good to try to think about it right from the start as being interdisciplinary, but it's not, obviously not necessary, because most people who come into the program have just one, you know, concentration. And it's more than a full-time job.
Exactly.
But you know, it's the kind of thing I'm here because I love it. So I, you know, love spending time on it.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, you have to be really, really interested in it. You know, I feel like people who succeed are they're here because they can't imagine doing anything else. You know, it's just what they love.
Nothing like.
So I am a second-year PhD student in the Cognitive and Neural Systems program. And my project is a Celeste-funded project, and it brings together two labs, this lab, the Neural Prosthetics Lab, for the BCI side, and the Neuromorphic Engineering Lab, which looks at mobile adaptive robotics. So my particular project is looking at how we can leverage the BCI technology that we're working on here to enable locked-in patients the ability to control robotic devices, mobile devices, to do things for them outside of their grasp, their reach. And the idea is that these robots would actually be autonomous. So we have a Roomba that would drive around, and you, as in the BCI, can control the Roomba through a video interface. So you can see what the robot sees, you can drive it around. The robot will also move around on its own. And then you can have it go to a target object and say, oh, I want you to go pick up this coffee cup, or I want you to go turn on a light. And so you're able to do that. So that's the work I'm currently doing. So the Neuromorphics Lab, their focus on robotics is in fact in this idea of robotics driven through neural models. Yeah. So our actual interest is how do we use what we understand about the brain, models of the brain, can we implement them in autonomous agents? Because standard robotics, you can do sort of what I like to call an engineered solution. It's just a bunch of differential equations. It handles very specific things. It's designed to do a very specific task. But humans are very generalizable, and that's something that we're really fascinated by. And that's what we look for in robotics is you know, object identification. We have a robot moving around. How can it tell that it's looking at a discrete object from a background, from a single image? It's a very hard problem, both in computer vision in general, but also in neural models. And we feel that if we can understand how the brain can do things like, how do we know how to reach out for something? This is such an intuitive concept to us, but to have a robot do this from a neural basis, and to be able to understand the difference between reaching like this or reaching like this, or reaching to an object, grasping an object, having an understanding that that is an object in the space, that is very hard to do from a standard sort of computer systems approach. So we feel that using neural models, the way we think that we do this, will give us an advantage in the long run to allow robots to be much more interactive in the environment, as well as with the human-robotic interaction.
Right.
My interest is actually primarily in the brain-machine interface. That's how I got into this. My background is in biomedical engineering and bioinformatics, and both of those were focused on neural engineering aspects. How do we, specifically on implantable electrodes, and then also in large-scale neural simulation, how can we use the neural signal to you know, basically go beyond ourselves? Can we interact for both rehabilitative and augmentative purposes? And this is something that I've been doing for a long time. I actually worked in the industry for a while before I came to this program. So it was a case where you can't do this when you're, you know, in a 9-to-5 job. sitting behind a computer all day. You just don't have the resources or the time. So I came back to grad school to work on this because it's just something I'm really, really fascinated and passionate about doing. I've spent many a sleepless night working on getting these things to work. So having the ability to work on things where I feel like I'm really working toward building something really useful, something that people could really benefit from, and that's something that just drives me to do this. And so, 24 hours at a time, that's fine,
Very few.
Computer programming is critical, absolutely. Having a good understanding of software development is very, very important for a lot of what we do because, as seen, these applications, they don't write themselves, and they have a lot of moving parts, and they have a lot of elements to make them look good and to be polished and to be functional. So having a strong computer background is very important. For brain-machine interface signal processing, absolutely need to understand signal processing, where these signals come from, how to deal with them, what it means to work with time series data is also critical. So, and obviously, it would help to understand the brain a little bit. So where these signals, why, what is generating these signals, why, as you're analyzing them, they're not just things that are created in a vacuum. They come from somewhere, and understanding that. EEG is highly, highly correlated. You need to know that these signals are highly related and accommodate for that so you can isolate those signals of interest.